Okay, chapter 13 is called The Master Puppeteer. Jiro retrieved the key and carefully unlocked the grating. From the theater, he could hear Toyoteki, I don't know how to pronounce that name, one of the senior reciters chanting the act. No one would be watching the storehouse at such a busy time of the afternoon, but he instinctively turned around and searched the courtyard before he slid in and closed the grating behind him. He stuck the key in his sash and made his way through the musty darkness toward the staircase at the rear of the building. He wasn't conscious of being nervous, but he realized that he was sweating and that a pulse in his temple was thumping painfully. He crept up the dark steps, putting his hands on the stair above and climbing like a cat, squinting his eyes in an attempt to accustom them quickly to the darkness. He made his way through the narrow open space toward the front of the storehouse and the light from the single window. Once there, he stood on tiptoe and ran his fingers across the top of the broad rafter to locate the sword, but it was harder to locate than he'd thought. Finally, he lifted a small chest from one of the stacks of chests and put it down in front of the window and slightly to the side of the center rafter and climbed up to look. The sword was gone. He tried to swallow his panic. It must be there. It was just too dark to see the black enameled sheath. He ran his outspread hands up and down the central rafter and came up with nothing except very dusty palms. It had to be the central rafter. The rest of the room was piled almost to the beams with boxes and chests. There was no way he could be mistaken about where the sword had been. Someone had moved it. He climbed down and sat upon the chest. His hands were halfway to his face when Jiro remembered how dirty they were. He wiped them methodically on the sides of his trousers. What was he going to do? Without the sword, Okada might not even believe him, and even if he did, they had no evidence with which to confront Yoshida. There was the basket, but he'd seen that months ago with a fall arrangement in it. Since then, Mrs. Yoshida would have changed the alcove theme at least twice for the different seasons, and there was no way quickly to find where the basket might be stashed away. Time. He had no time. He would be missed backstage before long. How could he even slip away for a few minutes to look? He had to go. He got up, put the chest back, and made his way through the narrow passageway toward the steps. Jiro put his left hand out to steady himself in the darkness and looked down. When he did so, his blood froze, for there at the bottom of the staircase, just barely distinguishable in the darkness, someone was coming. By the shape, he knew that that person was wearing a puppeteer's hood. There was no place to hide, but Jiro instinctively backed into the narrow passageway. The hooded figure moved up on the steps. When it reached the top and turned toward him, Jiro could see that it carried a male puppet. The left arm and legs dangled lifelessly from the doll, but the person had placed his hands at the neck and right arm and was manipulating the puppet in such a way that the doll seemed to be peering first to the left and then to the right in search of something or someone. Jiro had backed his way almost to the window when the puppet stopped and seemed to fix its gaze on him. "Ah," it said, "there you are. I've been looking everywhere for you." There was something in the voice that seemed familiar to Jiro, but especially with the added cloak of darkness around the puppeteer, Jiro could not escape the impression that the voice was coming from the wooden face. "Do you know," it continued, "what a dangerous thing curiosity can be?" Jiro flattened himself against the window, but the puppet stayed where it was. Remember the story of the peasant girl who was courted by a handsome suitor? She was not content that a high-born personage would deign to notice an ordinary girl like herself. She wanted to know what his name was, and who his noble parents might be, and where his ancestral home might stand. The puppet moved slightly, and the light from the window caught something shining in his right hand. Jiro recognized it at once as a puppet sword, which, like all the props of the Hanaza, was perfect in every detail, just slightly smaller than the originals. The girl, as you will remember, asked her nurse how she might learn her lover's identity, and the old woman gave her a needle as sharp as my sword here. The needle was threaded, and as her lover left, she stuck it deep into his garments. Then, giving him a head start, she and the nurse followed the thread. It led them out of the city and deep, deep into the forest, disappearing at last into a cave. Jiro knew the story, of course, but he waited, his throat dry, for the puppet to finish it. The old nurse lit a lamp, and the two curious women went into that cave. And what should they find but an enormous serpent writhing in pain, the needle pierced deep into its throat. The puppet began to writhe, and holding the sword before it, came toward Jiro in a kind of horrifying dance. Poor little Jiro. It was these words that made Jiro recognize the voice. "Why are you frightened? It is you who hold the needle to the serpent's flesh." "Okada?" Jiro could hardly whisper the name. "Okada? You wanted to get word to Saburo, did you not?" "Yes, but—" The hooded figure bowed. "But how? How can an old blind man be the dashing Saburo?" The chanter put down the puppet and lifted the hood from his head. "Ah, little Jiro, you make the mistake they all do." "Oh, so it's not Yoshida." Yoshida is famous throughout Osaka as the master puppeteer of the Hanaza. When it is I who manipulate Yoshida." He laughed his funny kind of sputtering laugh. "Yes, Saburo has many puppets. The whole East Wing belongs to him as well as Yoshida, and a chosen few on the outside who have sworn their life's blood to the cause. But Saburo is the only one. I alone am the master puppeteer." Jiro stood, his back against the thin window, hardly breathing, as if by not making a sound he could remain invisible to the blind man. But Okada took another step toward him, and the puppet's sword glinting in his hand. What am I to do? I come into my storehouse to find a mouse nibbling away at my treasure. What does the master do when he catches a mouse with its jaws sunk deep into... Jiro did not wait. He snatched the chest nearest him and threw it down between himself and the chanter. He grabbed another and piled it on top. Then scrambling... There's a picture here. Then scrambling upon them to the rafters, he swung himself up like a monkey and slid across above Okada's head. When he was past him, he jumped from the rafter and pushed more boxes and chests into the passageway. The blind man had dropped the sword to the floor and was flailing his arms around helplessly, trying to find a way out of the trap that Jiro was throwing up around him. Jiro, I command you, wait, I say. But Jiro was down the stairs and out the grating. He slammed it shut and then, half in panic, swung close from either side the giant iron doors and threw the heavy bolt in place. He, Jiri, had Saburo the bandit locked behind iron doors, and all he could think of was that poor old man thrashing his arms about, crying piteously for him to wait. He would have to find Kinji. Kinji would know what to do. He ran across the courtyard, but just as he got to the door, someone snatched his arm. Where in the devil have you been? Yoshida's usually placid figures were contorted with anger. Yoshida Kinji's disappeared, and you have to replace him on Okayo's feet. Okada's ill and can't go on. Believe me, Moshida smiled grimly. The master is in a proper mood, so take care. All the time he was speaking, Moshida was dressing Jiro in the black kimono. When he finished, he stuffed a hood over Jiro's head and shoved him toward the stage entrance, where Yoshida and the left-hand manipulator were waiting. Jiro grasped Okaya's hem between his fingers and bent into position. Ow! Some god saved him from crying aloud as Yoshida's high clog banged into his ankle. The next section, the three of them were gliding onto the stage behind the puppet. The performance of Torture by Kodo had begun. And that's the end of a very short chapter 13.